Now, thousands of survivors of the contaminated blood scandal have been awarded interim compensation payments after the government agreed to grant £100,000 to the surviving victims, as well as bereaved partners. Boris Johnson said that while nothing would make up for the pain and suffering caused, the payments would be made available as quickly as possible. More than 2,400 people died after receiving contaminated blood products in the 1970s and 1980s. It was the biggest treatment scandal in NHS history. Amelia Jenne reports.
The true toll of the NHS's greatest scandal will never be known. That the state was responsible was today conceded. Interim compensation payments finally signed off so that victims and the partners they left behind can end the financial uncertainty that's compounded their pain. From 1975 onwards, Richard Warwick was given contaminated blood products, like so many others at his boarding school for haemophiliacs.
At least 72 died. Many were good school friends. Some would go away for summer holidays and not come back.
The sense of fear must have been unimaginable.
It was terrible. You had the adverts come on the TV.
If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you.
We were infected. Don't die, AIDS don't die of ignorance. It was confirmation that we were going to die.
The advert was only the beginning. Infected with hepatitis B, C and then HIV, he and his wife have fought together through a lifetime of stigma.
I've lost 40 years of my life. I can't have a family. I'm unable to work. I've lost all job opportunities. I worked as a systems analyst before I was fired because I was suspected of having HIV. We lost our one and only chance of having a child because we were advised when Tina did become pregnant, when my wife did become pregnant, that we should have the child immediately aborted because of the risk to it. And money will never ever bring that back, no matter how much, it will never bring back life.
In 1973, the UK turned to US companies to cover the shortfall in its own volunteer-donated blood supplies. Companies that paid people in prisons and high-risk communities for their blood.
Much of it is bought from men who need money badly, like those down here on the skid rows of America's big cities.
The risk runs from 6 to 70 times greater than were the donors all from a volunteer source.
In 1975, Granada TV investigated alarm bells already sounding.
Since April 1974, there's been an unprecedented outbreak of hepatitis among haemophiliacs.
The then Health Minister Lord Owen said the UK must stop importing the products by 1977, a target missed and missed again. In 1982, the first blood product patients in the US started dying of AIDS. A year later, a study found 100% of haemophiliacs receiving commercial blood products were infected with hepatitis C. But it wasn't until 1988 that these dangerous products were entirely filtered out.
Too late for the many thousands whose lives have been lost or changed forever. Successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, ignored repeated calls for an inquiry. Now that one has begun, the urgency to get those compensation payments into people's accounts couldn't be more stark. On average, one victim dies every 4 days. Now, campaigners say that today's announcement is a vindication, but that it should have happened long ago, like it did in France or Ireland. That the decades-long refusal to accept liability added insult to injury.
You can't just pay out compensation in all those cases where there's no fault on the part of the doctors, there's no part on the fault of the health authority, and there's no fault on the part of the department. And that is a theme we're still maintaining. That runs. That's still the approach today, and I think any other approach would be quite impossible. You'd destroy the health service.
A former health secretary speaking there, and Prime Minister here, drawing audible gasps from the audience.
There's no amount of compensation you can give that could actually compensate for what had happened to them. What had happened to them was incredibly bad luck, awful, and it was not something that anybody was unsympathetic to.
Bad luck's losing a £10 note, not losing your husband.
That's right.
Sue Threakall's husband Bob died in 1991, Sue Gorman's Steve in 2018, just after the inquiry had opened. Their friendship has been forged over decades of campaigning.
My own son suffered from being known as the AIDS boy, or your dad's got AIDS.
That must be heartbreaking as a mother to feel that.
Well, he has twice said to me, I lost both my parents because of this. I lost Dad to AIDS and I've lost you to the campaign. And that's what they've done to us.
What does today mean to you? Did you ever think that you would get to this point?
It's good news that this is the first step to the government irrevocably admitting fault.
The inquiry, so long awaited, will report next year at the earliest.
Are you proud of yourselves?
I don't know. I've never really thought about it. Nobody's ever asked me that, have they? You?
No, not directly, no.
I want people to look me in the eye and at least shuffle around a bit and look a bit uncomfortable and say, well, actually, now I realise why you banged on about it for 4 decades.
Amelia, Jenne reporting there. And let's get more now from our health and social care editor, Victoria Macdonald, who's in our newsroom. Victoria.
Well, Cathy, you heard there, it's taken decades to get to just this point, and while the compensation has been welcomed, there are still victims, and they are victims who are not on the list because they are parents who lost their children or children who lost one or more of their parents. Now, I've been covering this since the early 90s, and it is a scandal. It's a tragedy, and one that was too often ignored by those in power. Partly, I think that stemmed from the stigma surrounding HIV and then hepatitis C, and then that was followed by the fear of new variant CJD, or what was once called mad cow disease. But also partly because respective governments feared the cost if they accepted liability. And the numbers have never been entirely clear. Yes, there were those with haemophilia, but there were also others who didn't have a clotting disorder, but who received the blood products. Now, my impression has been that, and I think respective governments just hoped this would all go away, but it hasn't. And the infected blood inquiry has helped more than anything, but what it comes down to are the really personal stories. I will never forget the young man already infected with HIV and hepatitis C, and who received a letter, I was there when he got it, telling him that he had been exposed to CJD. Or there's Colin John Smith, the first child haemophiliac to be infected with HIV. He was just 2 in 1984 when he was given factor VIII, and 7 when he died. Now, I spoke to Janet and Colin, his parents, in 2007, who learned that Department of Health officials had said to keep using the imported factor VIII, but maybe it wasn't wise to give it to children under 4. Now, that is something those parents, have had to live with forever after.
Victoria, thanks very much. Joining me now is Jason Evans, whose father died in 1993 after contracting HIV and hepatitis C from contaminated blood. As a child of a victim, he hasn't received any compensation to date. Jason Evans, thanks very much for coming on the programme. I wonder if this admission, if anyone ever doubted it, that the state was responsible for the blood scandal, if that gives you any comfort today?
Well, I think that's an interpretation of what this interim payment means, but I don't think we've actually heard a minister on record use those exact words. I think the community would welcome that if a minister would like to do that. It's one of the parts of the scandal that's always been there, where ministers kind of skirt around saying that by using all kinds of the cliche phrases like it was an appalling tragedy, it shouldn't have happened, but no one's actually ever said the state now accepts its legal liability. I think we'd all like to hear those words.
Well, so why do you think that families such as yourself haven't been compensated? And do you think you will eventually get that compensation?
Well, I think it's important to remember that with the announcement today is, of course, a step forward for the surviving victims and bereaved partners that are receiving this payment. That's an important step. But let's look at the numbers. We know that when it comes to HIV, that about 1,240 plus people were infected through the blood products your package just described. We know that as of September last year, about 229 surviving victims were registered with the support scheme, and we know through Freedom of Information data this week, 228 bereaved partners of those infected with HIV are registered with the scheme. So we have 457 families out of the original 1,240 plus receiving this payment. That's 37%, about a third who are receiving this payment. So 2/3 of the families are not receiving this payment. Personally, I think, like Victoria was saying there, that's probably a lot to do with minimising the cost of this, drawing an arbitrary ring fence. And it's really less about whether it's parents or children and more about each victim not being recognised.
So let's talk about the human cost of this, because you were, I think, 4 when your dad died. How has this scandal shaped your life?
Well, obviously, I've grown up without a father. He died when I was 4 years old in 1993. In fact, I've got letters here beside me, chronicling my father's own battle to try and get compensation. I attended a meeting with my father when he went to meet his MP when I was 1 year old in 1990. Here I am now 32 years old, still pursuing the same battle. It shaped my life. And the crazy thing is, in some ways, I consider myself to be one of the lucky ones, because we know there are people that lost both of their parents. There are people that lost multiple children. And I think something that's really important to remember here, when I've just explained to you about how 2/3 of people are excluded from this payment, the reason why is because of the age and circumstances of most of the people that are infected with HIV. So hundreds of the people that are infected were children, like we just saw, or relatively young men, and they were mostly men due to the nature of haemophilia. This clotting disorder, it does sometimes affect women, but it's less common than in men. And so what that means is that many of these people who are infected with HIV, they simply didn't live long enough to form relationships. And if they did, it's only very difficult to maintain a relationship, particularly at those times when you're infected with something like HIV. And I think the government must be aware of that, and that's why they've drawn these arbitrary lines.
Jason Evans, thank you very much for joining us. Well, I'm joined now by Lord Owen, who was a health minister in the 1970s and a long-time campaigner on behalf of contaminated blood victims. You heard Jason there talking about why he thought the government hadn't compensated more people. You heard Ken Clarke in the piece by Amelia saying you can't just pay up. Do you think that is the decision that has been taken by the government? They want to minimise the payout, and can you understand that in some ways?
Well, it's a tragedy and a scandal, and the tragedy was that we didn't self-sufficiency. When I announced to Parliament in 1975, and we had put in the capital injection, that we'd no longer, in 2 to 3 years, be taking in blood from countries where the donors were often drug addicts with a very, very dubious history. And we never, ever got any announcement that these people had been affected and were a responsibility of the state, and that we never honoured that.
And
even today, it's not quite there yet. Maybe they're saying the Langstaff inquiry will come out and make the decisions, and I'm sure they will. But it's a tragedy.
Well, and you said as health minister that you've got to stop importing these products in 1977, and that target kept on getting missed. Why do you think, at the end of the day, that was? What does that say about the state?
Well, I think successive governments didn't provide the money to carry through the self-sufficiency, and it was always scrimping and saving. There were people in the department who I work with, who were utterly convinced that this should be done, doctors and civil servants. And it amazed me when I came sort of back to looking at this issue 10 years later, to discover, because of a constituent who had been infected with HIV, that I realized that there was a much bigger scandal than just hepatitis C. And we were right into a major AIDS problem with a lot of people becoming more infected.
And I just want to read you what you told the inquiry. You said, "I've failed and I feel very miserable about it." And you have campaign for years. So how personally frustrated and angry do you feel about this?
I am very angry. I mean, you just saw some of those comments. They don't seem to understand. Now,
what do you mean, Ken Clark and John Major?
Yes, mistakes happen in a health service. It's bound to happen. You've got to own up and try to compensate for it. The intentions of the doctors, haemophilia is a very nasty illness for kids. If they bled into their bone, in their knees or in their arms, their joints, and they lived a disabled life, it was a risk that was worth taking as long as we were also trying to reduce this dependence on contaminated blood supplies from abroad. And we definitely needed to increase our own. And there was a pool of people wanting to volunteer. It was a money issue. They would not understand the issues and perhaps didn't understand the illnesses.
Just very briefly, do you think that we'll get closure on this scandal in your lifetime?
It'd be closure for some of the people, but many people have already died. Many people who have lived long years of looking after people with HIV or people who suffered very badly from haemophilia consequences. There can be no closure, but there are huge lessons to learn about the way the department was run and the way that the politicians ran it. And let's hope that's a lesson we really learn.
Lord Owen, I'm sorry to cut in. We've run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us.